Imagine a world strikingly similar to our own. It is a world of international trade, where ships cross the seas laden with luxury goods. A world of diplomacy, where kings call each other brother and sign peace treaties. A world of high technology, magnificent architecture, and complex supply chains. This was not the modern era. This was the year 1180 BC. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Within just a few decades, the thriving civilizations of the Egyptians, the Hittites, and the Mycenaeans collapsed. Great cities were burned to the ground and never resettled. Writing vanished. Art disappeared. Progress stopped. For 3,000 years, historians have asked one question: who killed the Bronze Age? Was it the mysterious sea peoples, invaders from the north who swept through the Mediterranean like a plague? For a long time, that was the answer. A simple story of barbarians destroying civilization. But new evidence has revealed a much darker and more terrifying truth. The Bronze Age wasn't murdered. It committed suicide. We are about to investigate the first systems collapse in human history. We will see how a perfect storm of climate change, pandemic, and war exposed the fatal flaw of a hyperconnected world. It is a story of how civilization can become so efficient that it becomes fragile. And as we look at the ruins of 1177 BC, we have to ask ourselves one uncomfortable question. Are we looking at ancient history, or are we looking at our own future? If you could travel back in time 3,200 years, you would not find a primitive world of scattered tribes. Instead, you would find a sophisticated, thriving, and deeply interconnected global system. This was the Late Bronze Age. Stretching from the mountains of Turkey to the Nile Delta in Egypt, and from the palaces of Greece to the ziggurats of Babylon, the Eastern Mediterranean was ruled by a group of great powers, often called the G8 of antiquity. In the south, there was the New Kingdom of Egypt, wealthy and golden under pharaohs like Amenhotep III. To the north, the Hittite Empire controlled the vast plains of Anatolia with their feared chariots. And to the west, the Mycenaeans, the ancestors of the Greeks, built massive citadels and dominated the Aegean Sea. These were not isolated islands of civilization. They were bound together by a complex web of trade, marriage, and diplomacy. We know this because we found their mail. In the ruins of Amarna in Egypt, archaeologists discovered clay tablets containing diplomatic letters between these kings. They did not speak as enemies, but as family. The Hittite king would write to the pharaoh of Egypt saying, "My brother, send me gold, for gold is as common as dust in your land." They exchanged gifts, doctors, and even princesses to seal alliances. This era represented the pinnacle of human achievement up to that point. International trade routes were secure. The arts flourished, and a wealthy merchant class began to emerge, moving goods across the known world. A perfect example is the Uluburun shipwreck discovered off the coast of Turkey. This single ship carried raw materials from 7 different cultures: ivory from Africa, amber from the Baltics, and glass from Canaan. It was a world of proto-globalization, a world where the stability of one nation depended entirely on the stability of its neighbors. They believed this golden age would last forever. But this interdependence, which created such immense wealth, was also a hidden trap. By linking their economies so tightly, they had inadvertently created a single, fragile system. The kings of the Late Bronze Age felt invincible, but they did not realize that by removing the boundaries between them, they had ensured that if one of them fell, they would all fall. And the first crack in this magnificent structure would not come from war, but from the very material that gave the age its name, bronze. To understand why this civilization collapsed, we must understand the technology that powered it. Bronze. This metal was not just a luxury. It was the essential material for tools, weapons, and construction. But bronze is not a natural element. It is an alloy, a mixture of 2 metals, 90% copper and 10% tin. And this specific recipe created the world's first strategic supply chain crisis. Copper was easy to find. The island of Cyprus, whose very name means copper, had massive mines that supplied the entire region. But tin was the problem. There were no major tin mines in the Mediterranean. To make the weapons that guarded their empires, the great powers had to import tin from thousands of miles away, from deep in Afghanistan or possibly as far away as Cornwall in Britain. Think about the logistics of that. In a world without trucks or trains, this vital resource had to travel overland through dangerous terrain, changing hands dozens of times before reaching the smelters in Egypt or Greece. Tin was the oil of the Bronze Age. Just as modern nations will go to war to secure oil pipelines, ancient kings were obsessed with keeping the tin routes open. Without tin, there is no bronze. Without bronze, the army is defenseless. This reliance on long-distance trade created a dangerous, just-in-time economy. The Mycenaean palaces didn't stockpile years' worth of metal. They relied on the constant arrival of merchant ships to keep their workshops running. It was a system designed for maximum efficiency, but zero resilience. A single disruption, a war in Mesopotamia, or pirates in the Mediterranean could send shockwaves through the entire price structure. We see hints of this anxiety in the records. Kings complaining about shipments being late or the quality of goods declining. They were operating on the razor's edge of supply and demand. Today, we worry about semiconductor shortages halting car production. In 1177 BC, a tin shortage didn't just stop production, it threatened the legitimacy of the state itself. The geopolitical tension was rising, but the great powers were too focused on the external trade routes to notice the rot that was spreading inside their own walls. Because the only thing more fragile than their supply chain was the rigid, unyielding social structure they had built on top of it. The societies of the Late Bronze Age were organized into what historians call palace economies. This was not a free market. It was a command economy, controlled entirely from the top down. In Mycenaean Greece, the palace was the center of everything. Farmers did not sell their grain. They handed it over to the palace. Artisans did not sell their pots. They worked for the palace rations. Bureaucrats recorded every single goat, every jar of oil, and every bronze sword on clay tablets. The administration was obsessive. They managed the flow of resources with incredible precision. This system allowed kings to mobilize vast resources for huge projects, like the pyramids of Egypt or the Lion Gate of Mycenae. But it came at a terrible cost: rigidity. The wealth gap was enormous. The elite lived in luxury, importing wine and perfumes, while the common population lived in servitude, barely surviving on subsistence rations. There was no middle class to absorb shocks. This meant the system had a single point of failure. If the palace was destroyed, or if the bureaucracy failed, the entire distribution network would collapse. The farmers wouldn't know where to send food, and the soldiers wouldn't get paid. By the late 13th century BC, the signs of strain were appearing everywhere. In Egypt, we have the first recorded labor strike in history, when tomb builders put down their tools because their rations were late. The social contract was breaking. The people were working harder, but the system was struggling to feed them. The population had grown, pushing the agricultural capacity to its limit. It was a complex system in the most dangerous sense, highly optimized for stability, but completely unable to handle chaos. It was like a tall, stiff building without shock absorbers, waiting for an earthquake. And the earthquake was coming. Not just metaphorically, but literally. Just as the internal economy began to rot, reports began to arrive from the coast. Watchtowers were lit. Messengers were dispatched. Strange ships had been spotted on the horizon. A new enemy, unlike anything the great powers had fought before, was approaching. The storm had begun. For decades, historians viewed the Late Bronze Age collapse as a murder mystery, and the prime suspects were a mysterious group of marauders known only as the Sea Peoples. They appear in a historical record like ghosts, emerging from the mist to burn and destroy. The most famous depiction of them is carved onto the walls of the mortuary temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu in Egypt. The inscriptions describe a terrifying confederation of tribes, with names like the Peliset, the Jeker, the Shiklesh, the Din, and the Weshish. The Egyptian texts scream of their brutality. They say, No land could stand before their arms. They tell us that these invaders swept through the Hittite lands, Cilicia and Cyprus, turning cities into ash. For a long time, the narrative was simple. Civilization was destroyed by barbarian invaders, a classic case of the civilized world being overrun by the uncivilized. But modern archaeology tells a much more complex and tragic story. When we look closer at the carvings at Medinet Habu, we don't just see warriors. We see ox carts. We see women, children, and household goods loaded onto wagons. This was not a military invasion in the traditional sense. It was a mass migration. These were not just Vikings looking for loot. These were desperate refugees. They were fleeing something terrible in their homelands, likely in the Aegean or the Western Mediterranean. They were moving south and east not to conquer, but to survive. They were looking for food and land. The Sea Peoples were likely a loose confederation of different groups, displaced by chaos in their own lands. Some, like the Shurdin, had actually served as mercenaries in the Egyptian army years earlier. They weren't unknown monsters. They were part of the Mediterranean periphery. So, if they were refugees, why were they so destructive? Imagine a starving population, numbering in the tens of thousands, arriving at the borders of a city that is already struggling to feed its own people. Conflict is inevitable. The Sea Peoples were not the root cause of the collapse. They were the stress test. They were the hammer that struck the glass, but the glass was already cracked. If the Sea Peoples were the hammer, who cracked the glass? Evidence gathered in the last 20 years points to a culprit far more powerful than any army, Mother Nature herself. We are looking at a multiplier effect, where multiple disasters strike at once, amplifying each other. First, the Earth moved. Geologists have identified a phenomenon known as an earthquake storm. This happens when a major fault line unzips over a period of decades. Between 1225 and 1175 BC, a series of massive earthquakes rippled across the eastern Mediterranean. We find the evidence in the ruins, crushed skeletons, tilted walls, and cities like Troy and Ugarit that show signs of seismic destruction before they were burned. But earthquakes alone rarely end civilizations. People rebuild. The real killer was something slower and more silent. Drought. For a long time, this was just a theory. But recent scientific analysis has given us the smoking gun. By analyzing ancient pollen grains found in sedimentary layers beneath lakes in Syria and Cyprus, scientists found a sharp decline in oak trees and flourishing wetlands, replaced by plants that thrive in arid, desert-like conditions. This data reveals a megadrought that lasted not for a few years, but for decades. This climate shift would have been catastrophic. Remember, the palace economies were rigid. They relied on surplus grain to pay their soldiers and bureaucrats. When the rains failed year after year, the surplus vanished. The just-in-time supply chain of food broke down. Famine spreads. We have a letter from a Hittite queen stating bluntly, "I have no grain in my lands." Another letter from the king of Ugarit pleads for a shipment of wheat just to keep his people alive. The hunger was real. This explains the movement of the Sea Peoples. They weren't invading for glory, they were migrating because their own lands had dried up. The drought pushed them out, and they crashed into civilizations that were already weakened by famine and earthquakes. It was a perfect storm of natural disasters. The collapse, when it finally arrived, was swift and terrifying. It happened roughly between 1200 and 1177 BC. One by one, the lights of civilization began to go out. The first giant to fall was the Hittite Empire. For centuries, the Hittites had ruled Anatolia. But suddenly, their capital, Hattusa, was abandoned. Interestingly, archaeologists found that the public buildings were emptied before they were burned. The royal family and the administration likely fled, seeing the end coming, leaving the city to be looted by the Kaskans or the Sea Peoples. The empire simply evaporated. Then the horror reached the Aegean. The great Mycenaean palaces, Pylos, Tiryns, Mycenae itself, were destroyed. At Pylos, We find clay tablets that seem to be written in a hasty panic, ordering coast guards to watch the sea. Then, silence. The palace was burned so hot that the clay tablets were baked into ceramic, accidentally preserving the record of their own destruction. But the most heartbreaking voice comes from the city of Ugarit, a wealthy trading hub on the coast of Syria. We found a clay tablet there, often called the last letter of Ugarit. It was written by the king to his ally in Cyprus. He writes, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? Thus, the country is abandoned to itself." It is a message of total helplessness. The king had sent his army to help the Hittites and his navy to defend the coast, leaving his own home defenseless. The tablet was found in a kiln. It was never sent. The city was sacked and burned before the clay could even cool. Ugarit was never rebuilt. The trade hub was gone, and with these cities went their culture. In Greece, the art of writing, linear bead vanished. The complex bureaucracy, the engineering, the literature, it was all forgotten. The survivors fled to the mountains or small villages. The era of the great powers was over. By 1177 BC, a fire had consumed almost everything. The Hittites were gone. Mycenae was in ruins. Troy had fallen. The sea peoples had swept through the Mediterranean like a tsunami, gathering strength with every city they sacked. Now, they turned their eyes toward the last superpower standing, Egypt. Ramses III knew they were coming. He had seen the smoke rising from the north. The inscriptions tell us he mobilized every spearman and archer in the kingdom. He knew he could not fight them on the open sea, so he set a trap. He allowed the enemy fleet to enter the mouth of the Nile Delta, luring them into shallow waters where their ships would be crowded and slow. The trap was sprung. Egyptian archers lined the riverbanks, raining thousands of arrows down onto the decks of the invading ships. At the same time, Egyptian galleys rammed the enemy vessels, capsizing them. It was a massacre. The temple carvings show the sea peoples being dragged from the water, bound, and executed. Ramses declared a glorious victory. He carved his triumph onto the walls of Medinet Habu to last forever. "My sword is like the wall of a mountain," he boasted. "I have overturned their cities. Their seed is not." It seemed that civilization had been saved. But history is often written by the victors to hide their wounds. In reality, this was a Pyrrhic victory. The war had drained the Egyptian treasury completely. The cost of the defense, combined with the loss of trade partners, broke the economy. Shortly after the victory, the first recorded assassination plot in Egyptian history took place, the Harem Conspiracy, where members of Ramses' own household tried to kill him. The internal order was collapsing. Egypt survived, but it was a shadow of its former self. It withdrew from the world, retreating behind its borders. The era of international diplomacy was over. The pharaoh was no longer a global player, but a lonely king ruling over a dying empire. The Bronze Age ended not with a bang, but with the exhausted gasp of a survivor who has nothing left to give. So, why did they fall? Why couldn't these great civilizations bounce back? After all, humanity had survived droughts and wars before. The answer lies not in history, but in science. Specifically, in complexity theory. The late Bronze Age was a complex system. It was composed of many parts: trade, agriculture, diplomacy, and production, all tightly linked together. In systems theory, this is called hypercoherence. When a system becomes too efficient, it loses its redundancy. Think back to the tin trade. Because the supply chain was so efficient, no one bothered to find alternative sources or stockpile enough reserves. They maximize profit, but sacrifice safety. This creates a domino effect. When the drought hit, it didn't just cause hunger. It caused the farmers to stop producing surplus goods. Without surplus goods, the merchants had nothing to trade. Without trade, the king lost his tax revenue. Without tax revenue, he couldn't pay the soldiers or buy the tin needed for weapons. And without soldiers, the kingdom couldn't defend itself against the migrating sea peoples. Do you see the pattern? It wasn't just the drought. It wasn't just the war. It was the fact that everything was connected. A failure in one node of the network instantly transmitted stress to all the other nodes. Historian Eric Klein calls this a perfect storm. If it had just been a drought, they might have survived. If it had just been the sea peoples, they could have fought them off. But it was everything at once, hitting a system that had become too complex for its own good. The more complex a society becomes, the more energy it requires just to maintain the status quo. By 1177 BC, the cost of solving these problems exceeded the resources available. The system simply ran out of energy. This is the ultimate lesson of the collapse. Civilization did not die because it was weak. It died because it was too interconnected to fail, until it did. What happens when the world ends? After 1177 BC, a silence fell over the Mediterranean. Historians call this period the Greek Dark Ages. It would last for nearly 400 years. The population plummeted. Estimates suggest that in some areas of Greece, 75% of the population disappeared. The survivors abandoned the coastal cities and retreated to small, isolated villages in the hills. The great international trade routes were cut. The flow of gold, ivory, and tin stopped. The world became smaller. People no longer looked outward to the horizon. They looked inward, focusing only on their own survival. The most shocking loss was literacy. The linear B script, used by the Mycenaeans to track their wealth, vanished completely. For centuries, the Greeks forgot how to write. History became oral. The stories of the great kings and battles were no longer recorded on clay, but whispered around campfires. These whispers eventually became legends. The ruins of the great Mycenaean walls were so huge that the later Greeks believed they must have been built by giants, the Cyclopes. They could not believe that their own ancestors were capable of such engineering. The memory of the Golden Age faded into myth. The Trojan War, the voyages of Odysseus, these are likely the distorted, romanticized memories of this collapse. They are the trauma of a civilization trying to understand how it lost everything. But in this darkness, a seed was planted. The collapse of the rigid palace economies forced people to innovate. They couldn't get tin to make bronze anymore, so they were forced to master a new, more difficult metal, iron. The collapse was a tragedy, yes, but it was also a reset. It cleared away the old, ossified structures and made room for something new to grow. But that growth would take centuries of darkness to begin. The destruction of the Bronze Age elite had one unintended benefit: the democratization of technology. Tin was rare and controlled by kings, but iron is everywhere. When the trade routes died, people were forced to use the red earth beneath their feet. This shifted power from the palace to the village. It was a painful transition, but it laid the foundation for the world we live in today. Resilience, it turns out, does not come from centralization. It comes from adaptability. But the ghost of 1177 BC still haunts us. Today, we have built a new global system, the G20, that is far more complex and interconnected than the Hittites or Egyptians could have ever imagined. We rely on supply chains that stretch across oceans. We rely on a climate that we assume will remain stable. And we assume that because we are advanced, we are safe. The late Bronze Age teaches us that progress is not a straight line. Complexity is not the same as strength. In fact, complexity often masks fragility. A hyper-efficient system is a system without a safety net. When we look at the ruins of Hattusa or Mycenae, we are not looking at an alien world. We are looking in a mirror. They thought they were too big to fail. They thought their diplomacy and their technology would save them. They were wrong. The question is not whether our system will face a storm like theirs. The question is, when the storm comes, will we be flexible enough to bend, or are we too rigid, destined to break? So, I have a specific question for you to answer in the comments below. Looking at our own hyperconnected world today, from the internet to global energy grids, which system do you think is our most fragile single point of failure? We read the comments because your perspectives add real value to this channel. If you found this analysis insightful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to support our work and join the discussion. And if you want to dive into another investigation about the hidden logic of history, click the video appearing on your screen now. Thank you for deep thinking with us.